To most people, Ed Gein didn't come across as someone who could hurt anyone. After all, he was bullied in school for having a speech impediment and for being effeminate. As an adult, he became his town's trusted handyman and worked on many families' homes, and was even a babysitter for some of them. However, there were some people who had their suspicions of him from the beginning, which would eventually become justified on November 16th, 1957, when Ed Gein would commit his last murder. Welcome, fellow Stardust. Thank you for joining me, Rainbow Fright, as I tell you the Butcher of Plainfield's story. In part 2, we'll explore 11 movies and characters that this notorious mama's boy inspired. Are you ready? Buckle up. Ed Gein's story begins with his mother, Augusta Wilhelmine Gein, formerly Augusta Wilhelmine Lerche, who was born in La Crosse, Wisconsin in 1878 to German immigrant parents who fled from Prussia during the old Lutheran exodus that took place in the mid-1900s. She was one of 8, and their household was an incredibly strict one. Her parents were very conservative and didn't welcome change. It was their belief that every human act and thought was born from sin, and all humans were doomed for eternal damnation in hell. On December 11, 1900, when Augusta was about 23, she married George Philip Gein, whose mother was also a German immigrant, but he was orphaned at a young age when his family drowned in the Mississippi River because of a flood. He was a reserved man and worked many different odd jobs, but he was also an alcoholic. Augusta was outrageously verbally abusive towards George and would even berate him in public. Afterward, he was always found at the local tavern, and times when he felt emboldened and confident enough, he'd come home and beat Augusta, who would then fall to her knees and beg God to kill her husband. In 1902, they had their first son, Henry George Gein. By this time, Augusta had become increasingly fearful of the world, and her religious beliefs seemed to become even more extremist. Although she regretted her decision in marrying George, there was no way her faith would allow her to divorce her husband. When Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27, 1906, she vowed that he would not become like other men. To achieve this, she kept Ed close and was controlling of his every move, though both of her children were subject to her military-like discipline. Every afternoon, Augusta would read verses from the Old Testament and Book of Revelation, preaching about death, murder, and divine retribution. Henry and Ed weren't allowed to have any friends, and were ordered to come straight home after school. If it was ever found out that they made friends, they were beaten. Augusta warned her children that all women, except her, were whores that were naturally promiscuous and instruments of the devil. She explained that, along with drinking alcohol, that sex was a sin, and that if they didn't remain virgins their entire lives, that they would suffer eternal damnation. She also told her boys not to have sex with other women in order to stay close to her, so that she could remain their number one. Needless to say, this left Ed sexually confused and frustrated. Given all of the information we have about Ed Gein, it's not far-fetched to say that Augusta and Ed had a sexual relationship, and when he masturbated, he was likely thinking of his mother. This is enough to turn any would-be normal individual into a sexually deviant criminal who is desperately searching for an outlet for his pent-up anger, hate, and aggression. Although Ed would say he loved his mother, it was clearly a love-hate relationship, one where he'd been essentially brainwashed, tortured, and manipulated. Not being allowed to have friends was just as well for Ed, who was bullied in school for a number of reasons. He had a lazy eye, he was effeminate, he'd suddenly burst into fits of laughter with himself, and he had a speech impediment. Because of this, and his overbearing mother, Ed became attached to Augusta. They were inseparable, unlike his brother Henry. So when Augusta forced the family to move to Plainfield in 1915 onto a 155-acre farm, Ed's dependency only worsened. But it was a dream for Augusta. This made it easier for her to further isolate her family from the dangers of the world. Fast forward 25 years to April 1st, 1940. George, Ed's father, dies at 66 of heart failure due to his drinking. This is when Ed and his brother Henry start picking up odd jobs around town, doing handiwork and whatever else was needed. During this time, if Ed wasn't out doing a job, he was at home obsessing over his mother. Henry, on the other hand, met a single mother of two who he was planning on marrying. With a bright future ahead of him, Henry wanted Ed to also find what made him happy. He approached Ed about his concerns over his toxic relationship with their mother, saying things about Augusta that only offended and angered Ed. In the days that followed that conversation, on May 16, 1944, Henry and Ed were out on the farm burning overgrown vegetation when the fire got out of control. The fire department showed up and found a frantic Ed who claimed he lost sight of Henry when the fire got out of control. But strangely, he was able to walk directly to where his body was laying. Henry was found face down, untouched by the fire, and despite the bruises on his head, foul play was ruled out. His cause of death was thought to be heart failure due to asphyxiation. Some of the townspeople weren't satisfied by this determination and were suspicious of Ed, but there was no evidence to prove that he was responsible for his older brother's death. Now Ed was living the dream. He finally had his mother and the farm all to himself. But this victory was short-lived, when only a year later, Augusta suffered a stroke. This incident left her paralyzed and bedridden. Her condition didn't deter her ability to continually verbally abuse Ed, calling him a weakling and a failure, and telling him that he'd be nothing without her. It was about this time that Ed started picking up shifts at the Central State Hospital down the street from his house, doing various odd jobs. Another year passed, and on December 29, 1945, Augusta experienced another stroke and passed away. As might be expected, Ed was devastated and said, quote, "He lost his only friend and one true love, and he was absolutely alone in the world," end quote. Alone on the farm, Ed decided to board up a couple of his mother's favorite rooms, including her bedroom, in order to keep them pristine as a sort of shrine for her. Or was he hoping for her return? The rest of the house was neglected and became trashed. Photos show that the house looked like that of a hoarder, but much worse, which will be explained here shortly. From here, Ed turns a new corner and evolves into the Plainfield ghoul and grave robber that the world knows him as today. About 18 months after Augusta's death, Ed decided to dig up her remains and brought her head home with him so he could shrink and memorialize it in his home. But Ed needed more, and he began to dig up the graves of other women who were around his mother's age and collected their skin and body parts in order to create a, quote, skin suit for him to wear, which he believed would aid him in becoming his mother. The skin suit wasn't the only thing crafted with human remains. It's reported that he dug up at least 40 graves in 3 different cemeteries. Eventually, Ed decided he needed fresher, more malleable skin for his projects, as the skin he harvested from the graves was too dry and hard to work with. So, he set his eyes on Mary Hogen, the owner of Pine Grove Tavern, one of the few places you could find Ed. He chose her because she resembled his mother. On December 8, 1954, Ed walked into Mary's bar, shot her, and dragged her lifeless body through the back door. The people of Plainfield grew concerned over the disappearance of Mary, but without any leads, there wasn't much authorities could do. However, there were some women who had no problem with pointing the finger at Ed, who said the look in his eyes unnerved them. It also didn't help that Ed would make, quote, jokes in regards to Mary's whereabouts, saying things like, "Mary's at my house, just hanging out." Because Ed seemed harmless and was a trusted babysitter for many families in the town, people didn't think much of his comments.
Well, I've known him ever since he was a little boy.
And he seems to be a little odd.
Odd. I always figured he was just perfectly harmless.
3 years later, on November 16, 1957, Plainfield had another disappearance on their hands. But this time, they were able to solve the case pretty quickly. Bernice Worden, who also reminded Ed of Augusta, was the owner of Worden Hardware. And when the store wasn't opened that day, patrons became suspicious and called the sheriff, who happened to be Bernice's son, Frank Worden. When he arrived, he saw that there was blood leading out the back door and the cash register was gone. He also found a receipt for antifreeze that was made out to none other than Ed Gein. When police arrived at Ed's home, what they found was a scene that was more gruesome than they could have ever imagined. Ed wasn't home when police showed up, but they decided to take a look around the farm anyway. But they quickly found Bernice's body in Ed's summer kitchen, behind the house, which was being hung from an overhead pulley by her feet. Ed was in the middle of prepping her body, so she had been cut from her pelvic area up to her chest, and her insides had been taken out. She was also decapitated. Her head was later found in a burlap sack with nails in the ears that had a piece of twine hanging from them. Ed had intended to hang her head on the wall as decoration, and even though her heart was found in a plastic bag near Ed's stove, he denied ever eating human remains. Once they made it into Ed's house, there was no escaping the stench. As mentioned before, Ed didn't take care of the house after Augusta died, except for her bedroom and one other room she spent a lot of time in, which he kept spotless. As for the rest of the house, garbage was everywhere, wall to wall, and the garbage consisted of whole human bones and body parts. But when Ed brought the bodies home from the cemeteries, he found many uses for several of the body parts of his victims. Skulls were found that were made into soup bowls and were also used as decoration on his bedposts, one of which was found to have belonged to his first victim, Mary Hogen. A lampshade was found that was made with the skin of a human face. Other furniture that was made from human skin were a wastebasket and the seat of several chairs in the house. A box was found along with the young girl's dress. The box contained 9 vulvas, 2 of which were determined to be from 15-year-olds. Ed also collected the fingernails of all his victims. 4 noses were found, along with a pair of lips that were fashioned to be the handle on a window shade drawstring. Ed also used his victims' skin to create clothing. There was a corset made from a female torso that was skinned from shoulder to waist, leggings that were made from human skin, a belt made from human female nipples, and masks made from the faces of his victims, one of which was Mary Hogen. Ed revealed later that he was attempting to create a, quote, woman suit in order to become his mother. He wanted to feel like he was crawling into her skin. There were many medical and anatomy books found in his home, which would explain his crafty work. It was estimated that about 15 bodies were recovered that day. Ed was arrested at the grocery store that same day. After several hours in granting his request of a slice of apple pie with cheese on top, he confessed to the murder of Bernice Worden and the mutilation of 9 bodies. It would be years before he confessed to the murder of Mary Hogen. Ed was charged with 1 count of murder and pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. He was then diagnosed with schizophrenia and found unfit to stand trial. He was then sent to the Central State Hospital, where he used to work. 10 years later, doctors reevaluated Ed and found that he was competent enough to stand trial. And so a second trial began on November 7th, 1968, and lasted 1 week.
Hey Ed, tell us how you feeling?
I think I better not.
Ed's lawyer opted to have a bench trial, excluding a jury. Judge Robert H. Gulmer found Ed guilty, but after the second trial pertaining to Ed's sanity, the judge ruled he was not guilty by reason of insanity, and he was sent back to the Central State Hospital. The judge also noted that due to prohibitive costs, Ed was only being charged for one murder, that of Bernice Worden. Ed was later transferred to Mendota State Hospital in Madison, Wisconsin, where he died of respiratory failure caused by lung cancer. He was 77 years old. Ed was buried in Plainfield, Wisconsin, next to his parents and brother, where his headstone would get chipped away at by people who were fascinated by this gruesome story. Eventually in 2000, the entire headstone was stolen, but was later recovered in 2001 in Seattle, Washington. It is now being stored at the Waushara County's Sheriff's Department in Wisconsin, and Ed's grave remains without a headstone. Tourists started coming around to this small, quiet town just to gawk at the Gein home, which was scheduled to go up for auction. But in 1958, it was set ablaze and burned to the ground. It's believed that the people of Plainfield saw Ed's home as a representation of evil, and that it shouldn't be auctioned off or treated like some sort of prize. So one of them, or a group of them, decided to take down the house so that they could move on with their lives without the burden of the sideshow that had been created.
The farm where Ed Gein lived and where much of the grisly evidence has been found has been leveled. It burned down one night.
When Ed was told his home had been burned down, his response was, just as well. Join me in part 2 as I delve into the many films and roles that were inspired by the Butcher of Plainfield. And thank you for joining me for part 1.
For this small Wisconsin community of under 700 persons, they remember the shock and the fear that suddenly gripped them when the grisly tale of Ed Gein became public.
Well, I've known him ever since he was a little boy.
And he seems to be a little odd.
I always figured he was just perfectly harmless.